Sup guys, Steven here today, and today I wanted to talk to you about the evolution of web development. And it's crazy because it's something that I've seen not only just evolve so drastically and so quickly, but it's also the thing that holds so dear to me in my heart because I've essentially seen it evolve with my own hands, right? So the way I like to see it is kind of like web development essentially evolved in three stages, right? And I'll break it down. First, it was the era of essentially from scratch, which is just using Notepad and coding up your markup, right? Then it evolved to essentially the design era, which was essentially using the Adobe Suite, for example, Photoshop, and designing your website in Photoshop and then exporting it out to in Dreamweaver and then going from there, right? And then now today you have essentially the era of content management systems. So let's get into it. So in the beginning, it all started, you literally had no other option than to essentially code your website using Notepad files, right? So essentially what you had to do was open up Notepad, create a new file, save it with an extension of .html. So it was an HTML file. So it was essentially you're building a web page. Then from there on, you would do the HTML markup, right? So first thing, HTML. Then you would go to head. And the head section, there was a title for the page. Close the head section, then you get into the body, right? And you put all your content there. You close the body, and then you close the HTML section. And just doing that took so long because, for example, if you had to for example, you had to create something with a row structure, right? So you wanted to create a list. You had to essentially, every single list had to have list items. So that's how you would essentially create or put in the content for your rows, right? So if this is a row, this is a row, this is a row. So every row would start with the type of list that so you would let's say, for example, you're building an ordered list, right? So title is OL, ordered list, and then you would start each row in the list or each item in the list with LI, right? So list item, and then you would write out the content and list item. Then you go to the next line, list item. You do this over and over, right? Same thing for tables, right? You'd have table, and you could even format the table however you want it. Give it a particular background color, text font, etc. And then you would do a row item, table row, so TR. And then you'd write out all the stuff, NTR, over and over and over, right? This took just so long, right? And then after that, at that time you didn't have CSS. So once that's done, you would then go back to each markup, and then you would do the custom styling, right? So text color, text font, size, etc., etc. And just this took so long just to build the web page, right? So a fuck ton of time and energy already was just taken in setting up the markup. And then it was taken even even more time and energy was spent designing the page how you want it. And this was one page, right? So the structure is always that um, in every website, you always created a index.html, right? And this is like the home page of your website. And within it, you would put all the links to your web page, right? And then once you put, say for example, you put the link for a page called services. So you would you would use the link markup for it, right? So ahref equals in quotes, and then it's like / and then the name of I don't remember. You would put in the name of the service.html page. I'm not sure exactly if you use the / or not. But anyways, you would do that for every link. And then every time you had a link, you would then have to create a new notepad file, save it services.html, and do the coding for that. Code that file. And if you had a huge website, this would take literally eons, right? So that was web development at its infancy, right? So then someone had a clever idea of, what if, so that, before that, then it evolved to like, hey, let's create this, let's add more functionality, let's add more options to your website in terms of styling, right? So that's where this idea of CSS came in, cascading style sheets. And what that meant is essentially within your HTML markup, HTML file, you would essentially import the style sheet file, which is essentially the file within which you would essentially had placed code that styled particular elements. Say for example, you wanted every single paragraph element to be red, right? And then to have the Verdana font, or to have the Blair MDITC font, right? You would essentially do that. And so now, instead of like before, to where you'd have to go in to like your paragraph tags, so P and then color equals red, font equals blah blah blah. You would essentially just set it once and it would apply to every single P element. Right? So that was a huge game changer just in that. Being able to set the styling at once for every single instance of that element, right? So that was huge. But then that still took a fuck ton of time just to create markup, create the structure of the HTML page, right? HTML, HTML, head, title, body, blah, 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 and then putting content, and then styling it, right? That took a long fucking time. So then, next game changer, which was the era of introduced by the design suites, notably the Adobe Creative Suites, right? So then they're like, hey, what if there was a way of designing your entire website exactly how you want it? Images, buttons, etc., and then going about and maybe doing the functional coding. So it's like using code only to tell when something was to be linked out, right? Or using code to essentially link out an image, right? Things like that, or link out a title, right? Because the majority of web designs or websites at the time were static, meaning you would just have content, and then like the only you can say occurrences, or the only time something was happening was when you were going somewhere else. So essentially, that was the only idea of user experience at the time. You just clicked the button and it did something, right? So because it was so simple, coding just said, what if we facilitated the whole process by only coding when we had to code that part, like when we only had to tell the website what to show up based on a button click, right? So that's where designing websites came into play. So you would essentially create your composition using Photoshop, right? Nice 6-slider. You would, or even like menu bar. And what you would do is every time you came upon a button, you would create what's called a slice, right? And a slice is essentially telling Photoshop that for this particular image, or for this section or this part of the website, there's going to be code that is going to be attributed to it. So what I want you to do is to make it programmable, right? So that's what slices did. So you create your website, and then you would just make slices out of buttons, out of any images that was linked out of everything that was going to be applied code to it, right? Then you would export your website for, there was a feature where you could essentially export the website. Export the design as a website, right? And then what it would do is Photoshop would generate everything that went into creating that website. I think at one point it even started generating like the CSS styling to it, right? So like it would export every single piece of code necessary to recreate that composition. And then what you would do is you take that whole thing, and it also generate, it would take every slice you made, it would essentially make an image out of it. And essentially what you were doing is you were taking the data that it exported and you would import it into Dreamweaver. And then from there you would add in the code to it. So you'd add in like what website, every button or every image or whatever, any program that needed to be done, you would add it there, right? So if when you clicked the button and went to a website, you would add it there. If you clicked an image and went to something, you would add it there. And then you'd also add in like all the little things that are necessary, like alt code for every single thing, right? And that's how it worked. And like because of that, it saved a fuck ton of time, because then you weren't spending all that time just building the exoskeleton of the website, right? You would just be able to do it at a radically quicker rate than before, right? So I was like this, you could call it like the second era, right? And then, I believe, no, and then on top, so now we go to the next era, right? Which is the era of what are called content management systems, right? And the simplest way I like to put it is like, think of fucking Iron Man, right? Iron Man, what he does when he wants to transform, Tony Stark, what he does when he wants to transform into Iron Man, he presses a button or he gives a command, right? And so what happens is all of a sudden his armor comes to him. First you get the hand, then you get the helmet, then you get the chest piece, you get the shoulder piece, you get the leg piece, etc. And it assembles into the full Iron Man suit, right? And that's essentially how content management systems work in my head, or the simplest way I could explain it. Meaning, at the click of a button, you're essentially getting this. It's like this machine, this robot, this conscientious automated being that deploys through automation, through programming, the whole design and programming and building process for you, right? Without you needing to essentially do too much of the coding. And why this is the case is because a multitude of developers spend time, energy, effort, soul into creating this thing that runs, that is not only easy to use, because as opposed to before, where you essentially had to code in every single element that you wanted to add. Say you wanted to add a paragraph back then, right? You literally had to go into the .html file for that particular web page and add in that column P and then color element and then put in the content. You had to do that in a way, you can call it manually. But now today, with the advent of content management systems, you're able to literally just do it visually through like a rich user interface, meaning it's literally a set of, it gives you an interface and it gives you all the elements that you want. Maybe you want to add an image to your website. Maybe you want to add a paragraph. Maybe you want to add in a button. You can just drag and drop that element onto the web page. And boom, there you have it, right? Without having to worry too much about the actual programming of the exoskeleton of your website or of the structure, right? So what do I mean by that? Like, in a sense, you can think of it like this, right? Every website consists of a header, a footer, a body, and even a sidebar, right? And a navigation menu. So instead of you programming that structure, just like before, having to do the markup for it, for every single thing over and over, it's done for you, right? Me, as I mentioned, I say the game changer is WordPress, and that's primarily what I'm talking about in this video, because not only does it do that, but it just really brings game-changing features that can facilitate not just that process, but just the process of like creating a game changer out of your website and essentially helping you focus more on the higher level purposes of your website, like what you want it to do, what kind of impact would you like to create, right? And then reverse engineering how you want to go about it, as opposed to actually getting into the nitty-gritty technical aspect of it. But what it does is it uses this feature of PHP that gives it a massive edge over all the others, which is what it does is it essentially references it creates a file. The structure of WordPress is essentially that it creates a file for every section that a website or a web page consists of. So there's a web page for the navigation menu. There's a file for the navigation menu that does that programming in PHP. There's a PHP file that does the programming for the sidebar, for the header, for the footer, for the body. And so when it builds a website, what you're essentially doing is it's calling to the file that pertains to that particular section, right? So when you're building your website, when you're clicking on that button and installing and running and choosing the theme and then choosing whatever, what's happening is essentially it goes in and it goes, okay, so let's find the file that starts essentially this chain of events to occur, right? Let's say it's a navigation menu. Goes to that file, runs a code that builds it. Then within that file, it points to the next file in the chain, right? Let's say it's like the sidebar. it goes to the sidebar file, runs the code, and then within that file, it references the next piece, the body, and does the same thing in the footer. And before you know it, you have a build website. And the game changer that is WordPress lies in the fact that not only do you have the user interface, meaning you won't ever have to see all of this that I'm talking about, because you'll have a way of essentially administrating, managing, and editing your website to your heart's content visually through buttons. But on top of that, if you do want to see this part of your website, if you are a developer and maybe you want to go a step further and do some more heavy-end customization, you can, because you have direct access to the files that create this beautiful thing that is your website. And if you have the knowledge, right, the PHP understanding, you can create your own code. You can create your own function. You can even modify the sequencing in a way that you would want it. Maybe you want it to refer to another file that does something else, and you can do that, right? So this is pretty much where we are with web development. And on top of that too, there's also the oncoming of JavaScript, which I like to think about it, it's essentially the language that does all the animations. The language that essentially transformed your websites from static, meaning it just stayed itself, there were just pictures and buttons, to now like dynamic, which is now when you go on a website and it animates, maybe it fades in nice and tight, that's JavaScript at work. Or maybe it bounces or it pulses, or like it hovers on, like when it hovers when you hover your cursor on a button or an image. That's JavaScript at work. Because at one point, developers kind of came together with like business-minded people, and they realized that we have to essentially work on the experience of a user, right? That if we can make everything more enjoyable, people are more likely going to want to not only spend time on your website and interact with your website, and even maybe help you in achieving the purpose of your website. Maybe help you buy a product, or buy a product that you're selling, or subscribe to your newsletter, or view your videos, things like that, right? Because up until that point, everything has just been enjoyable to experience. Maybe this video, this thing that you're providing, is even more enjoyable, right? And that's where the advent of like user experience, user interaction came about, right? And the way I like to think about it is, along with that, this idea, the ideas of like frameworks. So every day you'll hear about how like there's a new programming language, like think languages like Angular or Node.js or etc. And they're not real languages. Well, how I like to think about it, it's like libraries, meaning you could literally create or code JavaScript code that animates your element in the way that you want it, animates the entire page, etc., etc. That does something when you click it. You could do that, but then what people realize, why don't we take the object-oriented programming concept and apply it to development? And so what that means is now, instead of you having to go around and essentially, okay, I have to create a style sheet, right? And then I have to create a markup for my paragraph elements, right? And then let's say maybe I want to add JavaScript to them to make every paragraph element animate. Well, what if I actually want to just animate this particular paragraph element and not this one, right? So then now you get into this, it's essentially using the concept of classes. So essentially just kind of visit my programming tutorials to essentially get a more in-depth idea. But it's like creating like a robot that once you import or once you include into your program or once you include into your website, it essentially adds powers to your website by extending functionality, right? So in this case, these libraries, what they do is you just apply the particular class. And a class, you can think of it as like, it's like a predefined set of code that does a particular animations or stylings, right? It just comes with it. So you can say predefined set of animations and styling, right? And what you do is you import that library into your code, right? Import, and then it's like a script, right? And then within it, you import the particular library that you want to use. And now by doing that, you can now apply the predefined animation and styling to the particular elements and parts of your website that you want to do. And that's a game changer in itself because it saves you a lot of time and maybe having to manually apply it every single time that you want to, or maybe even having to go through a trial and error of like, oh, okay, crap, this code doesn't work, so I have to like fix it or find something that works with that particular element, right? So that's kind of how I see it. And you just have to always remember that these things save a fuck ton of time and energy, because the less amount of time you can get into just like the development side, and you can focus more on like the higher level, like the strategy, right? Like the higher level, like what are you trying to really accomplish, the better you'll be, because you'll just be more efficient, right? And you'll leave less room for error, right? Because, for example, in the past, if you didn't have a closing HTML tag, your website wouldn't, your web page wouldn't run, like it wouldn't show, right? Or if you like didn't close like an LI row or something. I mean, you didn't close a table row or something. Maybe that either the table wouldn't run or the web page will crash altogether. So the point is like the less you can leave room for error, the better you'll be, because you'll just be more efficient, and then you'll be spending less time debugging your website or your program or whatever it is, and you will be spending more time on creating and making it epic as fuck. Epic as fuck. Epic as fuck. Yeah. Anyways, so it's quite a mouthful, but I guess I was doing this so people not only appreciated what we have today, but even more saw the value in the talent that we had, right? Saw the value in like developers are still even coding from scratch and what it can offer you, because when you can code from scratch, you can actually literally go from zero to like building every single thing however you want, as opposed to maybe if you're designing and maybe you can't quite exactly get that design that you want, you might not have that like freedom that you will from someone just looking at a blank canvas, right? Or even if you're using a CMS, you might not be able to and if you don't see that button, or you don't see that thing that you want right there in that user interface, you might not be able to unless you hire or meet someone with the expertise that knows either how to use the tool in the way that you want it, or even knows how to program it how you would like it to be. Maybe even know how to customize it or do something else. So it's just kind of like a way of like really appreciating where we're at and just kind of mind blowing. Like, it's like if I had known that like web development would be so valuable today, I probably would have done a better job at like creating a better repository for my work. Because there are so many web pages that I did like hand coding that like I just have no way of retrieving because I just didn't think about backing it up. Right, like I have to remember like this career did not really blow up until recently, right? With the advent of like this renewed interest in like entrepreneurship and like building a business, right? At that time, it wasn't really as looked upon. But then, as all these things started coming about, people started realizing how valuable of a skill set it actually is. So, just kind of appreciate what you have today and like remember that behind every single tool, every single platform, every single thing that you use and see, there's been like trillions and trillions of people that just sweated and bled and toiled for it to be that fucking epic. So always just like appreciate and respect it, no matter what frustration you might be having, because it could always be fucking worse. Anyways, that was a long one. Didn't really expect that. Hope you guys got something out of it. And as always, swag fuck out.